Somewhere right now, a child is being taught that their religion is the one true path, and everyone else is wrong. Somewhere else, another child is being taught the exact same thing about a completely different God. They can't both be right. That assumption runs through most of human history. But then you start reading the mystics, a Christian monk in medieval Germany, a Hindu sage in the Upanishads, a Sufi poet in Persia, a Zen master in Japan. Different gods, different centuries, and somehow they all wrote down almost the same sentence. So a handful of philosophers began suggesting something far more unsettling. What if both children are right? What if every religion is just a different language describing the same reality? And the only reason they look like enemies is that none of them can see the whole mountain. By the end of this video, you might never look at your own beliefs the same way again. There's a name for this suspicion. It's called the perennial philosophy. Perennial, like a plant that dies back every winter and returns every spring from the same hidden root. The idea is that humanity's religions are the seasonal flowers, brightly colored, wildly different, blooming in their own places and times. But underneath them all runs a single root system. One truth, surfacing again and again, wearing whatever clothes the local culture happens to be wearing. It's worth being precise about what this idea is and is not, because almost everyone gets it wrong on first contact. The perennial philosophy does not say that all religions are the same. Anyone who has stood inside a cathedral, then a mosque, then a Hindu temple knows that's nonsense. The rituals are different. The laws are different. The stories about how the world began and how it ends are often flatly contradictory. The claim is stranger and more specific than that. It says that if you follow each of these religions all the way down, past the rituals and the rules and the stories, you eventually arrive at the same place. Different doors, same room. That's the theory. And for 500 years, some of the sharpest minds in history have been trying to figure out whether it's the deepest insight humanity ever had or the most seductive mistake. Let's start where the phrase was born. The year is 1540. Europe is tearing itself apart. Martin Luther has split the church, the Protestant Reformation is in full swing, and Catholics and Protestants are beginning the long, bloody argument over whose Christianity is the real one. And in the middle of all this, inside the Vatican itself, a Catholic scholar named Agostino Stucco sits down to write a book with a quietly radical thesis. Stucco was the Pope's own librarian, a devout Orthodox Catholic, no friend of the Reformers. But his book, titled in Latin De Perenni Philosophia, on the perennial philosophy, argued that there was one wisdom, one knowledge of the divine, that had appeared among all peoples in every age. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Persian sages, the Hebrew prophets. To Stucco, they had all been catching glimpses of the same eternal truth, a truth as old as humanity itself. He didn't invent that intuition. He gave it its lasting name. He was building on something already in the air. A few decades earlier, Renaissance thinkers in Florence, men like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, had become obsessed with the idea of an ancient theology, a prisca theologia, a primordial wisdom passed down from the dawn of time through legendary figures like the Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus. Pico went hunting for that single hidden truth everywhere he could find it. In Plato, in Aristotle, in the Hebrew Kabbalah, even in the Quran. The dream was always the same. Strip away the surface, and underneath, one truth. Then the phrase went quiet for a while, until one of the most brilliant minds in European history picked it back up. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the philosopher and mathematician who co-invented calculus, used the term philosophia perennis to describe his own conviction that the essential truths of philosophy have always existed and can be found, in some form, scattered across every system of thought in history. From Leibniz, the phrase passed into the bloodstream of Western philosophy, but the idea was about to leave the libraries entirely and go searching for evidence in the words of the mystics themselves. And this is where it gets genuinely strange. Because when you actually read the mystics of the world's religions, the people who claimed not just to believe in God, but to have directly experienced the ultimate reality, something uncanny starts to happen. They begin to contradict their own religions, and they begin to agree with each other. Take Meister Eckhart, a Christian friar and theologian in Germany, around the year 1300, a Dominican preacher so bold that the church eventually put him on trial for heresy. Eckhart said something that doesn't sound like ordinary Christianity at all. He said the eye through which he saw God was the same eye through which God saw him. One eye, one seeing. The seer and the seen collapsing into a single point. The soul and God, not two things gazing across a distance, but somehow one. Now travel back nearly 2,000 years before Eckhart, and 4,000 miles to the east, to ancient India, and the sacred texts called the Upanishads. There, a sage tries to explain ultimate reality to his son, and the teaching gets compressed into three of the most famous words in the history of religion. Tat tvam asi. That thou art. You, the self looking out from behind your eyes, and Brahman, the absolute ground of all existence, the foundation of the entire universe. They are not separate. They were never separate. The individual soul and the infinite are, at the deepest level, one and the same thing. It's the same collapse Eckhart described, written down on the other side of the world, in a different language, pointing at a different God, almost 2,000 years earlier. Go to the Sufis, the mystics of Islam, and you find it yet again. Poets like Rumi describing the soul's annihilation in God, the drop returning to the ocean, the lover dissolving so completely into the beloved that no separate self remains. Then go to Zen Buddhism, where there is no creator God at all, and you find masters pointing at the very same experience from the opposite direction. Not union with God, but the dropping away of the separate self entirely. The realization of emptiness, the discovery that the boundary between you and everything else was never really there. Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism. 4 religions that have fought wars over their differences, and their deepest contemplatives keep returning from the inner journey, describing the same thing in eerily similar words. The theologians argue. The mystics, it can seem, speak one language. That coincidence, or whatever it turns out to be, is the engine that has kept the perennial philosophy alive for centuries, because it demands an explanation. And there are really only 2 on offer. Either the mystics are all tapping into one genuine reality, or the human mind, under certain extreme conditions, produces a similar inner experience that each person then interprets through their own religion. Hold on to that fork in the road. We'll come back to it, because it's where this entire story eventually breaks open. For a long time, this stayed a quiet idea, passed between scholars and contemplatives. Then, in the 19th century, a man in Bengal turned it into something you could watch with your own eyes. His name was Ramakrishna. Born in 1836, he was a Hindu priest at a temple near Calcutta, and he was not content to simply believe that all religions led to God. He decided to test it, personally. He devoted himself to intense Hindu practice until, he said, he encountered the divine directly. Then he did something almost no one in history had done. He took up the practice of Islam, following its disciplines, until he reported reaching the same realization. Later, he immersed himself in Christianity, meditating on Jesus, and reported arriving again at the same goal. His conclusion became one of the most quoted lines in modern spirituality. As many faiths, so many paths. To Ramakrishna, the religions were not rivals. They were routes, different roads winding up the same mountain toward the same summit, and the people fighting over which road was correct had simply never climbed high enough to see that the paths converge. Ramakrishna had a brilliant young disciple named Vivekananda, and in 1893, Vivekananda carried this message out of India and onto the world stage. The occasion was the World's Parliament of Religions in Chicago, the first great global gathering of the planet's faiths. He stood before an audience of thousands, opened with the words, "Sisters and Brothers of America," and reportedly drew a roaring ovation before he had said anything else. Then he told that audience that he belonged to a tradition which had taught the world both tolerance and the acceptance of all religions as true, not just tolerated, but true. In a century soaked in missionary triumphalism, when the dominant assumption was that there was one correct faith and the rest were error, it landed like a thunderclap. The idea that all religions might be valid paths to the same reality had gone from a philosopher's footnote to a movement. And then came the man who put it all between two covers and handed it to the world. In 1945, with the Second World War still smoldering, the British writer Aldous Huxley published a book and simply called it The Perennial Philosophy. Huxley was already famous as the author of the dystopian novel Brave New World, one of the most piercing minds of his generation, nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 9 separate times. And in this book, he did something methodical. He gathered the writings of mystics and the sacred texts of traditions from across the world: Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, Sufi, the Upanishads, Meister Eckhart, Rumi, Lao Tzu, the Diamond Sutra. He arranged them side by side under shared themes, so a reader could see the convergence with their own eyes. Huxley boiled the perennial philosophy down to a few core claims: that there is a divine reality underlying the entire world of things and minds, that this reality is not just something out there to be believed in, but something that can be directly known, realized, experienced within a human being, and that the whole purpose of human life is to discover that you are, at your very ground, identical with that divine reality. He pointed straight at those 3 Sanskrit words from the Upanishads, Tattvam Asi, that thou art, and called them the single most compact expression of the entire philosophy. To Huxley, this was not one religion among many. It was the highest common factor of all of them, the gold buried under every tradition's particular dirt. The book became a landmark. For millions of readers in the West, it was the first time anyone had laid the world's spiritual traditions on a single table and made the case that they were all reaching for the same thing. But Huxley was, in the end, a collector of quotations. The most rigorous, hard-edged version of this idea came from somewhere else, from a small group of thinkers who treated the unity of religions not as an inspiring sentiment, but as a precise, almost mathematical metaphysics. And they would have warned you that Huxley's warm optimism was missing something crucial. If this is the kind of question that keeps you up at night, the kind nobody fully settles in a single conversation, take a second to subscribe. This channel goes deep into the ideas at the edges of religion, philosophy, and the things we're usually not supposed to talk about. Now, back to the group that turned all of this into a system. They're called the Traditionalist school, and they are among the most fascinating and least-known thinkers of the entire 20th century. It began with a French metaphysician named René Guénon, who in 1921 published a study of Hindu doctrines, and went on to argue that the modern world had lost contact with a primordial wisdom that the ancient traditions still quietly preserved. But the idea reached its sharpest form in 1948, in a book by a Swiss thinker named Frithjof Schuon, titled The Transcendent Unity of Religions. The poet T.S. Eliot said he had never met a more impressive work in the comparative study of Eastern and Western religion. Schuon's argument turns on a single distinction, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every religion, he said, has two dimensions. There is the exoteric dimension, the outer religion. The rituals, the laws, the doctrines, the institutions, the version that most believers practice their entire lives. And then there is the esoteric dimension, the inner religion, the mystical core, reached only by a few, where the believer doesn't just worship the divine, but seeks to directly know it, to become one with it. And here is the crucial move. On the outer, exoteric level, the religions really are different, Schuon said, and they are supposed to be. A religion is like a language, shaped for a specific people, a specific culture, a specific moment in history. Of course, the languages don't match. But on the inner, esoteric level, at the very summit of the mystical path, the differences fall away, and the traditions meet in a single transcendent truth. Schuon captured it in an image that has defined the idea ever since. The religions, he said, are one at the summit and many at the base, climbers on different faces of the same mountain, far apart at the bottom, converging as they near the peak. Now, pay close attention here, because this is exactly where people misunderstand the perennial philosophy, and where that weak version, the lazy, all religions are the same, completely falls apart. Schuon was not telling you to blend religions together into some custom spiritual smoothie. He despised that idea. He thought that trying to mix traditions, a little Buddhism here, a little Christianity there, actually destroyed the very thing that makes each one a working path. His view was almost the opposite of casual modern spirituality. He believed you reach the universal summit by climbing one real mountain all the way up, by genuinely committing to a single authentic tradition and following it down to its mystical depths, not by hovering at the base, sampling all of them. The unity is at the top, and you only get to the top by climbing. So let's lay out the strongest version of the case, because it's stronger than it first appears. Start with the convergence we already saw. The fact that mystics from radically different, often openly hostile traditions, separated by oceans and centuries, with no way to copy from each other, keep reporting the same core experience, a dissolving of the separate self, a union with, or absorption into, an ultimate reality. A sense that the deepest truth is one, not many. If these traditions had no contact, and yet they keep arriving at the same summit, then perhaps the summit is real, and they are all describing something that is actually there. Then add the structure. Look closely, and the same architecture shows up across the traditions, a distinction between the everyday self and a deeper, truer self. The idea that the divide between you and ultimate reality is, in some sense, an illusion to be seen through. The conviction that the highest knowledge comes not from arguments or books, but from direct experience, beyond words. The self is one with Brahman in the Upanishads. The kingdom of God is within you in the Gospels. Look within, the Buddhists say, because the answer was never outside. From the perennialist's chair, these are not vague resemblances you have to squint to see. They are the same blueprint, drawn by people who never once saw each other's plans. And there is a moral weight to it that's hard to ignore. If the perennialists are right, then the entire history of religious violence, the Crusades, the Holy Wars, the persecutions, the centuries of human beings killing each other over which name for God is the correct one is one of the darkest jokes ever told. People slaughtering one another at the base of the mountain, never once realizing they were all climbing toward the same peak. That is a staggering, almost unbearable idea, and for a long time it looked close to unbeatable, until a philosopher came along and aimed straight at its foundation. His name is Stephen Katz, and in 1978 he published an essay that landed on the perennial philosophy like a wrecking ball. His argument is deceptively simple, and it is genuinely hard to answer. The entire perennialist case rests on one assumption: that underneath all the different descriptions, the mystics are having the same experience. Katz attacked that assumption head-on. There are, he argued, no pure experiences. None. There is no such thing as a raw, unfiltered encounter with reality that you only afterward dress up in the words of your culture. Instead, every experience a human being has, including a mystical one, is shaped from the very beginning by the concepts, the language, the expectations, and the training that the person brings to it. Think about what that actually means. A Christian mystic spends years steeped in the idea of a personal God, of Christ, of the soul longing for union with its Creator. So when that mystic finally has a profound experience, they experience union with a personal God, because that is the shape their mind was trained to perceive. A Buddhist spends years training in the doctrine that there is no self and no creator God, that ultimate reality is emptiness. So when the Buddhist has a profound experience, they experience emptiness, the absence of self. Katz's point is that these are not the same experience described in two languages. They are two genuinely different experiences, produced by two different sets of training. The Christian's union and the Buddhist's emptiness only look alike from a great distance after someone has quietly stripped away everything that made each one specific. In other words, the convergence that got the perennialists so excited might be something they manufactured themselves. Line up the mystics, delete the contradictions as mere surface detail, translate everyone into the same fuzzy vocabulary of oneness and the absolute, and of course they start to rhyme. You built the rhyme by choosing what to ignore. This view is called constructivism, and it dominated the academic study of mysticism for decades. It takes the perennial philosophy's single greatest strength, the convergence, and turns it into a possible illusion of its own making. But the story does not end with Katz, because not everyone was convinced that human experience is constructed all the way down. A philosopher named Robert Foreman led the pushback. He and others pointed to a specific kind of mystical report that shows up across traditions, and that is very hard to explain Katz's way. They called it the pure consciousness event. It's the description, found in Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian sources alike, of a state of awareness that is completely empty of content. No thoughts, no images, no concepts, no sense of being a separate self at all. Just bare, wakeful consciousness, aware of nothing in particular, not even itself. And here is the problem that poses for constructivism. If a mystical experience is supposed to be built out of your concepts and your expectations, then what exactly happens in a state that, by definition, contains no concepts at all? You can't construct an experience out of content when the entire experience is the absence of content. Foreman's argument is that this contentless awareness is exactly the kind of thing that could be the same across traditions, precisely because there is nothing culturally specific left inside it to differ. The frameworks shape everything on the way up the mountain. But at the very summit, where all content drops away, maybe there really is just one thing. So where does that leave us? Honestly, unresolved. And that's the truth of it. Most scholars today land somewhere in the middle, accepting that culture and language shape mystical experience far more deeply than Huxley ever admitted, while leaving the door open to the possibility that something genuinely shared sits at the very bottom. The strong claim that all religions are obviously one looks naive. The opposite claim, that the resemblances are pure coincidence with nothing real underneath, has its own holes. The mountain is still there. We just can't agree on whether the different climbers are reaching the same peak or describing entirely different mountains that happen to look alike in the fog. Which brings us back to those two children we started with. The one taught that their faith is the only true path, and the one taught the exact same thing about a different God. The perennial philosophy offers them a strange and beautiful possibility, that they were never really enemies, that the thing each of them was reaching for, underneath the names and the rituals and the inherited certainties, might be one and the same, that the great traditions are less like rival armies and more like translations of a book none of us has ever read in the original. But the perennial philosophy also carries a quiet danger, and it's only fair to name it. In our eagerness to find unity, we can become careless about difference. We can wave away the things a tradition holds most sacred, its specific laws, its specific stories, the specific shape of its God, as mere packaging, as if the wrapping doesn't matter. And to the people inside that tradition, the wrapping is not nothing. Sometimes the wrapping is everything. A Buddhist who says there is no God, and a Muslim who says there is one God, are not obviously saying the same thing in different words. They might simply disagree. The honest version of this idea has to hold both possibilities at once, the breathtaking chance that we are all climbing one mountain, and the real chance that we are not. Maybe that is the most useful place to end. Not with an answer, but with a better question. The next time you feel certain that your way of seeing the ultimate is the only way, it's worth remembering that a Christian friar in Germany, a sage in ancient India, a Sufi poet in Persia, and a Zen master in Japan all went looking for the deepest truth they could find. And what they came back with sounded, against all odds, almost the same. They might all have been wrong, but they might have seen something. And either way, the question of whether all religions are secretly one is not a question we have answered. It is a question we are still living inside. If this gave you something to think about, there is another video on screen right now that goes deeper into the hidden, esoteric side of the world's religions, the part the textbooks tend to leave out. Go watch that one next. And if you want more journeys to the strange edges of belief, history, and the mysteries we have never quite solved, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.